So welcome everyone to the kind of panel discussion on the crisis in Ukraine. I'm Digvijay Mehra. I'm the president of the Queen's International Affairs Association, which is the organization that's hosting this event in collaboration with the Queen's University Political Studies Department. Just before we start, a bit about KIA. We're a club here at Queen's University that does events like these, as well as a variety of other different things, everything from publishing a magazine to hosting a radio show to organizing an internship program and a few conferences, a model UN team, and many, many other different initiatives. KIA is actually in the process of hiring our new executive for next year, so I would highly suggest that if any of you are interested in events like these or getting further involved with our club, that you consider applying. All the applications and information about that is available online on our website at kia.org, QIAA.org/apply. There's also another event that we're hosting later this evening at 7 p.m. at the Screening Room downtown in Kingston. We're screening The Square. It's a documentary on Tahrir Square. And after the documentary, we'll be having a PhD student here at Queen's who was at the Tahrir Square protests giving a bit of his insights in the form of a Q&A after that screening. So that screening is at 7 p.m. tonight at the Screening Room, if you're interested in that. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our lovely moderator, Isabelle Duchaigne. She is a former vice president of KIA and also the current president of the Queen's Politics DSC.
Co-president.
Co-president, and I think her other co-president is also here, Lisa. But yeah, so Isabelle will explain the event and everything else. So Isabelle Duchaigne.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. I think it's important to point out that we are also being live streamed by Queen's TV. This will be available later on the KIA YouTube channel, so if you're tuning in later online at home or currently streaming from the castle, that's also wonderful. Welcome, all of you fans at home as well. A little bit about how this discussion is going to work today. We have 5 different panelists, each representing a huge amount of insight on the current situation in Ukraine and offering more historical perspective on the region. What we're going to be having is one professor speaking for about 10 minutes at a time. At the 1-minute mark, I'll be passing this piece of paper across the table, so they'll be knowing to conclude their statements, and after that I'll be introducing the next panelist to speak. When that portion is completed, we'll be having a Q&A. So throughout the conversation, be sure to tune in with the hashtag, hashtag KIAUKR, that's hashtag KIA, Queen's International Affairs Association, QIAA, UKR if you want to kind of connect with people going around at the time. And if at any point you can't hear any of our speakers, just put your hand up and we'll start working with the microphones. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first presenter panelist for this afternoon. Professor ANA SILJAK is a professor in the History Department at Queen's. Her research and teaching focus on the history of 19th century Russia, especially on the questions of terrorism, national identity, and religious culture. Her book, Angel of Vengeance, The Girl Assassin, The Governor of St. Petersburg, and Russia's Revolutionary World, was a finalist for the Charles Taylor Prize in 2009. Her current research on the Silver Age in Russian literature and culture is supported by the SSHRC Insight Development Grant. Welcome, Professor SILJAK.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the organizers for this great event. I am actually looking forward to learning a lot, as well as presenting some information at this event. Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm actually an expert on the history of Russia. And I think the way I see my role here is not so much to give you a 10-minute history of Ukraine, which would be impossible in any case. But I think what I would like to do is give you a sort of sense about what history does and does not explain about the current situation in Ukraine. And in a way to show how history is contested in Ukraine, and that in turn leads to, I think, some of the current qualities of the conflict we see today. So I'm going to limit my remarks basically to the historical context and to some elements of the historical context that I think contribute to the problems that we see in Ukraine today. It's really hard to know where to begin, mostly because depending on who you are in Ukraine, you begin at very different times with very different interpretations. I'm just going to give you one example. Let's take the 2 well-respected history textbooks ones that are used currently in classrooms. One by Oris Septelny on Ukraine, and the other on Russia by Nicholas Ryazanovsky. And these histories of Russia and Ukraine respectively begin in the same place. That is in Kievan Rus, a powerful principality centered around the city of Kiev from the late 10th to about the 13th centuries when the Mongols conquered it. Both sides will claim that the history of their nation begins here. And both are right. Both will argue that the other side is wrong in thinking that Kievan Rus is Russian and or Ukrainian, and in that sense both are wrong. The debates over Kievan Rus and its contributions to the histories of Ukraine and Russia center around things like Prince Vladimir, ruler of Kiev between 980 and 1015, who first joined the Byzantine Orthodox Church and is thus credited with bringing Christianity both to Ukraine and to Russia. The contested nature of the history, the contested national histories of both countries center around this region, and it is very important to start there in order to adjudicate claims and counterclaims that you might hear about whose states or whose territories these really are. The reason the history of Ukraine is a complicated one is centers even around its name. Ukraine, in translation, basically comes from the word that meaning borderland. Ukraine was always a borderland. It was a place with incredible ethnic and religious diversity, and it was contested by and claimed by various states over its history. The Mongols of the 13th century swept through this region. The Lithuanian state of the 14th century then came through. Then came the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who's depicted here, and you can see the borders of present-day Ukraine within this territory. This is the map of the Polish-Ukrainian Commonwealth around 1619. And then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ruled over this territory of Ukraine in the 16th and 17th century. Parts of what is presently Ukraine fell under Russian rule in 1686. And then the rest of Ukraine was divided up in the so-called three partitions of Poland between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, the bulk of Ukraine going to the two states, to the two empires of Russia and Austria in the late 18th century. Right, so you see parts of Ukraine, if you see Ukraine is depicted right here, you see that parts of Ukraine, these territories go to Austria and parts go to Russia. To further complicate matters, let's just complicate them a bit further. In 1596, the Catholics agreed to establish a separate Catholic church in Ukraine, a so-called Uniate church that preserved the language and liturgy of the Russian Orthodox churches, but placed that church under the Pope in Rome. So there's a substantial number still today of so-called Uniate Christians or Greek Catholic Christians in Ukraine. As a result of the changing of imperial hands from one to the other, Ukraine, up until the ethnic cleansing of, say, the 45 to 48 period, had a very diverse ethnic and religious population. It's reflected in the names you find for cities and regions. Look up the different names for even cities like Kharkiv, Kharkov, or the city of Lvov, which is my favorite, Lviv in Ukrainian, Lvov in Poland, Lemberg in German, and in Russian Lvov, right? So depending on whose territory you were in, cities and towns and regions could have different names. Ukraine was home to a variety of peoples. You had the legacies, you had the Polish and Lithuanian noble elites that remained in the region all the way up until World War II. Polish and Lithuanian noble elites, and they're living on their landed estates. You had Orthodox Christian and you had Uniate peasants. And the reason I use the term Orthodox Christian and Uniate for peasants of the 18th and up until the 19th century is that the terms Ukrainian and Russian were still unstable well up into the 20th century. If you were to go to a peasant in the 19th, even well into the 20th century, and asked, are you Ukrainian or Russian, they may not know what you are talking about. They will say, we are ours, we are nashi, we speak our language. We don't understand the national terminology which you are trying to box us into, right? And so there were a lot of Soviet national experts who were desperately trying to categorize populations under Soviet territories that were asking desperately these peasants to choose a nationality, and often they could not, right? We have to keep in mind that nationalism and national identity are modern phenomena. This is something that scholars have emphasized in the last maybe 30 years, and it's something that's well worth bearing in mind when we look at the history of Ukraine in particular, but even the neighboring states such as Austria and Russia. It was in the 19th century, during this sudden full flowering of national identities and the rediscovery or supposed rediscovery of national identities throughout Europe, that a number of educated elites in Ukraine decided basically that they were neither part of the Polish elite nor part of the Russian imperial state. They were instead their own people, a Ukrainian people with a separate language, a separate culture, a separate history, and a separate literature and poetry. And this national revival that really flourished in the 1830s and 1840s with the poetry of sort of leading Ukrainian nationalists that all Ukrainians are still familiar with, Taras Shevchenko. It was in the 1830s and the 1840s that national ballads started being written about Ukraine, introducing a distinct national language for the Ukrainian people. He was actually exiled by the Russians for his pains, right? The Russians were not about to tolerate the creation of yet a new national identity within their borders. But Ukrainian nationalism grew despite this and culminated in a journal in 1861 called The Foundation, which argued forcefully that there was such a thing as a separate Ukrainian national identity as distinct from the Polish and the Russian. Now, in the late 19th century, this was seen as a war cry, not just by the Russian state that had occupied much of territorial Ukraine, but also by the Poles who saw Ukrainians as nascent Poles. And so a war of Polonification versus Russification occurred in the late 19th century. Russification was part of the Russian official approach to Ukraine. And you could see, you know, if you talk about Russian-Ukrainian hostility, you could date the beginnings of that right there, right? The Russians claiming that Ukrainians were not Ukrainians, but as they term it, little Russians, right? Little Russians, not quite Russians, but little Russians. And the hostility then with Russification begins then. Now, the revolutions of 1917 brought down Russia, but the 20th century was unkind to the Ukrainians. There was a civil war after 1917 in which millions of Ukrainians died. Of course, there was within kind of living memory, there was collectivization Ukraine initiated by Stalin, where peasants were herded into large collective farms. Those who resisted were killed, and famine, terror killed over 10 million Ukrainians. This is, of course, something that the Ukrainians remember quite well, and Ukrainians have officially declared this a genocide. And one final point about history. When Hitler invades Russia, there were many in Russia who were favorable to the Nazis because they saw them as liberators from the hostile Soviet state. When we talk today about a fascist element in Ukrainian politics, there's a way in which this fascist element is very small, and it is not good to overestimate their power. Nonetheless, you could see how this could bring back terrible memories for many who live there. Okay, a final image. 30 more seconds. The legacy, finally we get to the ethnic cleansing of Ukraine from 1945 to 1948. Ukraine, the Jews that were killed during the Holocaust wiped out the tremendous Jewish population in Ukraine. Then the Poles are transferred to Poland. Ukrainians come to Ukraine. As a result, today's population is almost 78% Ukrainians, 17% Russian. The map here shows the present-day ethnic distribution of Ukrainians versus Russians. As you go further east, you see more Russians. As you go further west, you see more Ukrainians, right? So the yellow are the number of Ukrainians. The gray are the number of Russians, okay? I can talk about Crimea if you want, but my time is up. But it is, one last point, just a sentence. If we see the conflict in Ukraine as that of Ukrainians versus Putin, we will have trouble because of this. Because of the large Russian minority that, regardless of what Putin thinks, has its own voice, its own say, its own fears. So we have to remember that when we talk about this conflict between Ukrainians and Russians in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those at the back who have just come in, there are quite a few seats available in this quadrant over here, as well as right up at the front. You get a first row seat to all the action. And next up we have Professor George PERLIN, who is a Professor Emeritus of Political Studies, whose teaching and research has focused on Canadian democracy and international democratic development. From 1998 to 2010, he directed CETA-funded projects to help Ukraine establish a program of education in the study of democracies for its universities, technical colleges, and secondary schools. In November 2008, in recognition of his contribution to democratic reform in Ukraine, PERLIN was elected as an international member of Ukraine's National Academy of Pedagogical Science. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I don't know if do I need to use this thing? You can all hear me at the back? Excellent. I need two hands. The other panelists are going to talk to you about the geopolitical issues which have arisen over the past month. I want to provide you with some context about factors that contributed to the protests and about the strains within Ukraine, which I am arguing, while they have clearly had significant short-term implications, once the issue of Crimea is resolved one way or the other, once the relationship with Russia is resolved one way or the other, in the short term, Ukraine will still have significant problems to deal with in managing the internal stresses. So what I want to do is to describe some of these to you. My comments are based on a series of public opinion surveys which I did as part of my work in Ukraine. These were very extensive surveys done in home, undertaken by Ukrainians who have been specializing in the study of public opinion in Ukraine. So it wasn't something that we simply transposed and asked them to deal with, to apply for us. So what do we learn from these surveys, which were done in 2000, 2005, and 2010? The first thing that I want to draw your attention to is that there is a clear perception of ineffectual governance, which resulted from the character of politics within the Ukrainian parliament, which is called the Rada. That's produced widespread alienation from the political elite. It's one factor which has produced widespread alienation from the political elite. A critical point here is that the Orange Revolution in 2004, which involved a series of protests, much like the protests we saw on Maidan starting in November, but ultimately of a very different character and a very different outcome. The result was the overturning of a presidential election, the election of the leader of the Orange movement, which was essentially representing itself as a democratic reform movement, and the coming to power of members of that Orange Revolution. The problem for many of the people on Maidan this time was that the Orange Revolution did not live up to expectations. Ineffectual governance continued. It is related to the fact that within the parliament, within the Rada, political power is organized and brokered through factions led by patrons who aren't associated with necessarily a particular political party, but simply in kind of patron-client relations with large numbers of people who have been elected with their support and continue to hold their positions in the Rada thanks to their support. So patron-client relations, as you may have discovered from your courses in political studies, those of you who've been there, involve mutual support relations. The result of this in the period of the post-Orange period, from 2005 to 2010, was factionalism leading to unstable governance. There were 2 parliamentary elections within 2 years of each other, 2006, 2007. There were 4 changes in the cabinet of ministers, although the president, Viktor Yushchenko, continued to hold his office. So the instability of that period, as I say, contributed to ineffectual governance and created disappointed expectations about the Orange Revolution. Second element in the alienation of large segments of the population is a lack of trust in the political elite. The events in the Rada that I've just described to you, the brokering of power by factional leaders, the constant movement, often from one bloc to another, of members of parliament, all of these things, and persistent corruption, all of these things undermine whatever hope that people had that the Orange Revolution would produce real reform. One measure I have of that is that we asked some questions about how people thought the political elite viewed their role. One of those questions looked at integrity as measured by perceptions of the degree of honesty of people in the Rada. The other question asked about whether people thought that members of the Rada had a commitment to public service or essentially were there solely for self-serving purposes. The number of people who gave positive answers to those 2 questions, exactly the same range, was less than 9%. The general view of the Rada following the 2005-2010 period was of a political elite, an entire political elite, not just the people who have been replaced after the Orange Revolution, but the people who took their place. The entire political elite was corrupt. This had a very significant influence on the expectations of the agreement with the European Union, because many people looked at it not as a mechanism for, or not exclusively as a mechanism for improving the economic situation of Ukraine, but also as a mechanism for bringing about political change, for strengthening liberal democracy within Ukraine. A second major source of strain within Ukraine has been the result of the emphasis on cultural nationalism in the nation-building strategy of the political elite. That emphasis on cultural nationalism has created a continuing source of conflict over language policy, because when Ukraine was established, as an independent state, the Ukrainian language was declared to be the only official language. That issue has recurred through virtually every election. It remained up until 2012 unresolved. In 2012, the Yanukovych administration got a majority in the Rada, in the parliament, to pass a law which permitted regional governments, local governments, to establish minority languages as official languages if 10% of their population spoke that minority language. This was a very contentious law and produced ongoing conflict. If we come forward to the actions of the new government, the interim government, which replaced the administration which had been established under President Yanukovych's leadership, one of the very first things they did was to repeal that law which established Russian, or gave Russia the possibility of becoming an official language. This was a very contentious issue and has fed the conflict since then. I think probably my time is up.
You have 30 more seconds.
Well, what I've been trying to do is to establish for you the context in which the protests occurred. I will tell you that on Euromaidan, as it was called, there were people who were interested in liberal democratic reform. There were people who advocated cultural nationalism. There were people who were there because of their concern about the relationship with the European Union. So it was quite a complex group. I'd argue that the interim administration is problematic in its character because significant elements have not been included.
All right, thank you very much. Third, we have Professor Charles Pentland, who is a professor of political studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he teaches courses on international organization and global governance. He holds a BA and an MA from the University of British Columbia and a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. He was director of Queen's University's Center for International Relations from 2002 to 2010, and for the past several years, his research and publications have focused on the external relations of the European Union, especially an eastward enlargement in its role in the Balkans, its relations with the former Soviet Union, and its common foreign and security policy. He has also written on Canadian foreign policy and transatlantic relations, and is co-editor of a recent volume on the last years of the international mission in Afghanistan.
Thanks, Isabel. I will try and keep within your rigorous time constraints, so I'll dispense with a lot of fancy introductory terms. I just want to say that I'm starting from a kind of a puzzle or a paradox. I'm going to talk about the role of the European Union in this conflict that we've been obsessed with since November, if not before. The paradox or the puzzle is simply this. That there's no doubt that the European Union has been a major presence, a major player throughout this crisis. And yet it seems to have been, at critical points, strangely ineffective in turning the conflict in a constructive direction. So I want to, that's sort of in the back of my mind, and I hope will be in the back of yours as I take you through some of this discussion about the EU's role in all of this. I think it seems to me that the EU, and by the way, when I say the EU, I mean really two things. You have to, given the way its foreign relations are conducted. There are the EU institutions proper, which means really the President of the Commission, who at the moment is Barroso from Portugal, and the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, who at the moment is Catherine Ashton. They represent the EU as such. But you will have noticed that all kinds of EU governments also send people to discuss the issues with various players in the Ukrainian crisis. So I mean both the EU as such and critical EU members, Germany, Poland, and so on. That's simply the way the system now works. I think the EU has played three roles as this crisis has unfolded. The first one, we can put it slightly grandly, it's the collective face of Europe as far as Ukrainians are concerned. Whether for good or ill, those who think their future lies in Europe will be drawn to that face in a positive way. Those who are suspicious of it, and there are many in Ukraine, will have a rather different view of its involvement. But in any case, in either case, it is the face of Europe, collectively speaking. Secondly, the EU has tried at various times to be a mediator, particularly in what we can call the Maidan period, the period following the failure of the Vilnius summit, which was supposed to see the signing of an EU-Ukraine agreement, particularly between that time and then when things began to unravel in Crimea. And thirdly, an ally. Since the Crimea issue has come to the forefront, the EU has emerged as an ally, as a part of the Western coalition, if you like, reacting against Russian actions, threatening various kinds of counteractions, and at the same time engaging at some level in negotiations. So quickly then, first, Europe, the EU as the face of Europe, and here I mean largely since 1991, when Ukraine became independent, and when the EU began to develop much more of a personality, international personality. As you may know, the EU was largely preoccupied from 1994 to 2004, and in fact on to 2007, with incorporating many states from the former Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, Romania, Hungary. And at the same time, NATO was also involved in a parallel enlargement, which had the effect of pushing the boundaries of Europe and the Atlantic world eastward toward Russia. Not something Russia could do a great deal about in the 90s, as it was largely chaotic, and the orientation was largely at that time toward becoming part of the global community, particularly under Yeltsin. So what came out of this was partnership and cooperation agreements for many of the states in Eastern Europe, particularly former Soviet republics. There were three of them that actually became part of the EU in 2004 as a result of the enlargement process. But the remainder, and here we mean really Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and the three Caucasus states, remained outside that process with no prospect of becoming members. So how did the EU respond to them? Quite simply, it offered them a different kind of arrangement, partnership and cooperation agreements. Kind of vague, but what it means really is aid, some trade assistance, some technical assistance, and a lot of talk back and forth, regular meetings, to try and, if you like, socialize these countries into the European way of doing things. After 2003, 2004, after the enlargement was consummated that I mentioned, these countries were then drawn into something called the European neighborhood policy, which essentially offered these former Soviet republics that I mentioned various kinds of economic and other incentives, more intense cooperation. The objective of the ENP was to create a zone of security, stability, and prosperity. Incidentally, not just for those buffer states, if you like, again, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, and the Caucasus states, but also lumped in with the same group were the states of the southern shore of the Mediterranean, who had a separate arrangement, so-called Barcelona Agreement, with the EU. What did this mean for Ukraine in particular? Ukrainians, the Ukrainian leadership at that time said, the EU hasn't offered us membership. What they've done is lumped us in with the likes of Algeria, Libya, countries that aren't even European and have no chance of ever joining the European Union. Might there be a message there? They don't want us, or they want us in a particular category, a little bit different from other European countries. Not a good political statement, perhaps. So the ENP, the European Neighborhood Policy, promised or aimed at Europeanization of those countries, but without the carrot, if you like, the ultimate attraction of membership in the European Union. That was studiously avoided in all these agreements. The Ukrainian government at the time, particularly under Kuchma, who was the president up until just before the Orange Revolution, blithely ignored a lot of these messages and simply said, well, we're aiming for membership by 2011 or by 2015. We see that as a realistic goal. And the Europeans kept saying, that's not actually on the cards. We're not talking about that. We're talking about getting your house in order so that ultimately, way down the line, we may begin talking about this, but we're not going there at the moment. And Kuchma would simply come back with another, well, how about 2016? And so on. There was no meeting of minds on these things for that whole period. So the EU was reluctant to go farther than that, until much later, after the Orange Revolution, the idea came up for an association agreement, which is a standard form of EU agreement with outsiders, plus what was called a deep and comprehensive free trade area. I won't go into the details of what deep and comprehensive mean. Just let it be known that the eventual, and you can look up the agreement on the internet, it's massive. I mean, it's over 350 articles, I think, over 300 pages of mind-numbing detail on phytosanitary cooperation and all things of that sort. This is what they were negotiating from intensely from about 2008 right down to the end of last year. Somebody remarked that basically once power shifted to Yanukovych in 2010, the EU continued with these negotiations, basically holding its nose. They knew who they were dealing with. But then, as we know, of course, at the Vilnius summit in November of 2013, all expectations being that Ukraine would sign, Yanukovych did a U-turn and said he wasn't going to sign the agreement and that he was much more attracted by a Russian offer. Yikes. Okay. Why that outcome? First of all, the nature of the treaty, as I just explained. It's massively complex, hugely demanding of the Ukrainians in terms of the transformation that would be required of them. A 10-year process at least across a vast range of areas, as Professor PERLIN mentioned, not just trade, but human rights, rule of law, administrative practices, democracy, all the rest of it. It's all in there. It's huge. And I suggest to you a formidable obstacle just in its complexity. Second, quite frankly, the Ukrainian government was an inadequate partner in these negotiations. Not too bad on some of the technical and legal stuff, but hopelessly dysfunctional, corrupt, and playing a double game through most of it. Third, Putin's offer, of course, came along at precisely that moment, more lucrative and less demanding. Lots of money, no questions asked. Third, Fourth, frankly, what this shows you is the limits of the capacity for the European Union to exercise soft power. If I may, briefly, very briefly, the EU as mediator. It acted as a mediator during the Orange Revolution. Professor PERLIN mentioned the outcome of that. That was brokered by EU representatives, by the Polish and Lithuanian presidents, and by the Speaker of the Russian Duma. This time, a similar attempt was made without the Russians, tellingly, by Catherine Ashton, the High Rep, and several foreign ministers once the Maidan had started. So there were negotiations in Kiev to change the government, etc., etc. Those negotiations succeeded in getting to an agreement, but of course it was then bypassed. And the agreement, for reasons PERLIN also suggested, lacked credibility. It had no credibility in the Maidan because of distrust of the political class by practically everybody there. The EU had misplayed its hand slightly by actually showing up in the Maidan and showing support, which is great, except it doesn't make you a very credible mediator with the other side. And so there was cynicism on the other side. Yanukovych said, you guys aren't serious, you're not really impartial, you're on their side. So it's surprising not got any agreement at all. And thirdly, the real point, real power lay not there, but in the Maidan and in Russia. And so the agreement that the EU brokered was, shall we say, overtaken by events.
All right, Professor, I'm very sorry about
That's
that.
fine.
But I will
Yep.
very much look kindly upon when we get to question period if somebody can ask perhaps as a question, maybe more along those lines, so we can get to hopefully the end of your statements in a very short period of time. But for now, I'd like to introduce panelist number 4, Professor GEORGE C, who specializes in the study of nationalism in contemporary European politics, with particular focus on post-communist Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. CHERGO received her PhD from George Washington University and has held positions at George Washington University and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. Professor CHERGO is currently working on a comparative book project about minority integration in the enlarged European Union, while her articles have appeared in major peer-reviewed journals, including Perspectives on Politics, Foreign Policy, and Nationalism, among others. Currently, Professor CHERGO serves as president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities, the largest international academic association in the field of nationalism and ethnic studies, housed at the Harriman Institute of Columbia University, New York. Welcome, Professor CHERGO.
Thank you, and thank you very much for organizing this roundtable. I know it's overdue. And it's a great opportunity for us as well to hear each other and learn from each other's perspectives. And I'm going to start by, can you hear me in the back, by the way, or should I turn this on? Okay, turn it on. Is it better this way? Can you hear it? No? How do I turn it on?
It's on.
Is it on? Yeah, okay. All right, so I am going to focus on politics, on the politics of nation building in post-communist Ukraine. Actually, I should say that I'm going to situate the Ukrainian crisis within the context of post-communist politics. And I'm emphasizing the word politics because the research that comes out from this region and also scholars of the region shows us that really the primary drivers of conflicts and the way conflicts have unfolded in the region really have to do with politics and political actors way more than cultural differences. And so I think it's a good sequence that I'm following the presentation by Professor Charles Pentland, because obviously the framework within which these conflicts have been unfolding in a democratic or less democratic way has to do with the European Union's Eastern enlargement. And so all of these countries, not only those that have become EU member states, but those who have aspired to become EU member states, have been affected, significantly influenced by the EU integration project. And much of the scholarship that has been focusing on democratization in this region has actually focused on, at least to some degree, on how the EU integration process and EU membership conditionality has shaped conflict. And everyone understands, everyone who works on democratization understands that the question for democratizers is not to do away with conflict, but to democratize conflict in a sense, democratize the ways in which conflict is expressed and dealt with. And this may sound a bit counterintuitive to you guys, but I'm going to say that, in fact, in Ukraine, since 1991, which is 23 years of independent statehood, and it's 23 years of a very difficult struggle of state building and nation building in a region that has the background that Professor ANA SILJAK has presented to us. Despite of that in fact most of the major actors have been playing the game within at least a thinly conceived democratic framework, meaning that even though there is this, if you will, master cleavage, master regional cleavage between the predominantly Russian-speaking eastern region of Ukraine, which means quite a few people. The predominantly Ukrainian-speaking western part of Ukraine, despite that master cleavage, what's really important to see is that, in fact, even the 2004 Orange Revolution showed that the interest that really ties these people together, that's shared commonly by the majority of the population of Ukraine, is in building a democratic regime, a democratic government. And in fact, and this is another point statement I'm going to make that might sound a bit counterintuitive to it and contrary to what Professor Pentland has actually just said, is that the power, yes, there is a lot of power in Moscow. Yes, there is a lot of power in the hands of the president of Russia, because don't get me started on the super presidential system of Russia, because I can go on for hours about that. But despite that, the power is really not so much in Russia. I'm going to say to you that, in fact, one reason why President Putin wants to bring back Crimea as a bounty, if that's a good term to use, for domestic consumption to reinforce his power base. Not that he needs to reinforce that very much, but the system is still competitive. There are still elections in Russia. But the reason why he needs Crimea, I would think, I'm convinced at this point, but things are changing, is precisely that Moscow has been actually quite unsuccessful in influencing the politics of Ukraine. And I promised the organizers that I would be focusing my comments primarily on Russia as a kin state, the influence of Russia as a kin state. And I'm going to say to you that Russia as a kin state, as a state that is acting supposedly on behalf of Russian speakers abroad, protecting the rights and interests, the cultural interests of Russian speakers abroad, has been a very particular kind of kin state compared to many other kin states that abound in this entire region. Russia is a regional power that is reasserting itself as such since about 2000, right, the Putin presidency. And it's a very strategically driven kin state that is not so much interested in building a greater Russian nation that shares a common tradition, a common national canon, if you will, but much more interested in making sure that it has more influence over neighboring countries than the European Union. And so if you look at the acts of Russians' kin state behavior, kin state involvement, activism, since the beginning of the 1990s, actually mid-1990s, on the one hand, of course, there is the talk of Russia as a kin state. And in 2005, I found this quote that Putin, in his annual address to the Federal Assembly, said, I'm quoting, "Above all, we should acknowledge that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of the century. As for the Russian nation, it became a genuine drama. Tens of millions of our co-citizens and compatriots found themselves outside Russian territory," and so on and so forth. At the same time, those of us who actually have studied Russia as a king state comparatively, comparing it to much smaller, insignificant powers like Hungary, for example, or Albania, for example, the idea that Russia is actually trying to, the Russian center in Moscow is trying to build a pan-Russian nation somehow is really overblown. That's the Russian center's rhetoric. But if you actually analyze what they do, which is what we should be doing in political science and social science, what you see that it's a much more cynical power game. And so the interference is usually in the creation of these so-called frozen conflicts. I'm not the only one to say that, but Russia goes in to Transnistria, for example, to provide resources for secessionists there, but Russia does not incorporate Transnistria. Russia goes in, I'm using obviously these reified categories of Russia, right? So Russians support secessionism in Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and so on. They interfere. But do they want to actually incorporate these territories? Do they want to actually then start nationalizing the population in these territories and building this grand national narrative and nationhood? I don't think that that's the case at all. I don't think Crimea either is primarily about revisionism. Crimea obviously is about Sevastopol and the military base in Sevastopol. And it's also about Putin's domestic politics of needing to bring back something after all of the failures of trying to really influence Ukrainian politics in the center, because, and I have to say this, because on the ground, and this is what comes out from surveys, public opinion surveys, the truth is that majority Russian-speaking people of East Ukraine are just as interested in democracy and the rule of law as the majority Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians in Western Ukraine. And I'm really not making this up because there are surveys you can actually, I'm happy to direct anyone to sources about this. If you look at, there's a foreign policy article that was published recently by co-authored by Oksana Sheva and I forget who Maria Popova, in which they present charts about, respondents' answer to the question of what takes them to the Maidan. And by the way, Russian-speaking Ukrainians from Eastern Ukraine went and joined the demonstrations in the Maidan. Those who could go and were not dissuaded by all kinds of coercive ways. So the primary reason why people went has been the rule of law. And the EU was never even close to the significance of the rule of law in the minds of these people. So I'm making, I suppose, just in closing, I suppose I'm making a case for the potential of democratization continuing in Ukraine based on what surveys show about the shared interest of the population in Ukraine, and at the same time telling you that yes, I agree that on Sunday probably Crimea is going to be then declaring and reinforcing through a referendum, reinforcing this idea of secession. Okay.
Thank you very much. We now have our last speaker before we move into question period. Dr. Pierre Jolicoeur is a professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada since 2007. He is currently head of the Department of Political Science. He mainly teaches courses on international relations and strategic studies. His theoretical work focuses on secessionism, federalism, ethnic conflict, and conflict resolution. Dr. Jolicoeur is also a specialist of the Caucasus and Southeastern Europe. He has published extensively on security issues in that area, and he is currently working on a book about Chechnya. Welcome.
I'd like to speak without microphone. Do you hear me well? Okay, good. So thank you for those kind words, and thank you for inviting me across the river. I don't have many occasions to come at Queen's University. In my career, I did some work on Russian foreign policy, but I'm not going to here make a statement or explain or justify any Russian actions in Ukraine. I will just talk in terms of geopolitics and the way Russians are seeing the events in Ukraine. But before to start to read my paper, I will just would like to remind you that in the Russian elite's point of view, the way they see international relations is very traditional in nature, very geopolitical game. And if we apply the in terms of school of thought in international relations, it's really the old realism that still applies in terms of through the Russian elite's eyes. So if a state is gaining in influence in one area, it can only be done at the detriment of other states. So that's the way, more or less. I mean, of course, it's a bit of a simplification, but it's still the way that Russian elites are seeing the big game. So my presentation is basically in two major points I'd like to do. First, talking on Ukrainian crisis, and then the broader political game since the end of the Cold War, to put the Ukrainian crisis in context. So the current crisis in Ukraine is only the latest manifestation of competition between the West and Russia. The European Union and the United States greatly influenced the 2004 Orange Revolution in terms of financing and political organization. Russia, meanwhile, greatly influenced to discredit the Orange regime and the subsequent election of Yanukovych, who lost in the Orange Revolution 2004, but who won in 2010. The West pushed back once more by supporting the Euromaidan movement after Yanukovych abandoned key EU integration deals. And then Russia countered in Crimea, leading to the current impasse. As you can see, the tug of war between Russia and the West over Ukraine has gradually intensified over the past decade. This has hardened positions in Ukraine, culminating in the formation of armed groups representing rival political interests and leading to the violent standoff in Independence Square that quickly spread to other parts of the country. The current government enjoys Western support, but Moscow and many eastern and southern Ukraine deny its legitimacy, citing the manner in which it took power. This sets a dangerous precedent because it challenges the sitting governments and any future government's ability to claim any semblance of nationwide legitimacy. A second, more worrying effect of the competition between the West and Russia over Ukraine extends beyond Ukrainian borders. As competition over the fate of Ukraine has escalated, it has also intensified Western-Russian competition elsewhere in the region. Georgia and Moldova, it was mentioned earlier, two former Soviet countries that have sought stronger ties with the West, have accelerated their attempts to further integrate with the European Union, and in Georgia's case, with NATO. On the other hand, countries such as Belarus and Armenia have sought to strengthen their economic and security ties with Russia. Countries already strongly integrated with the West, like the Baltics, are glad to see Western powers stand up to Russia. But meanwhile, they know that they could be the next in line in the struggle between Russia and the West. Russia could hit them economically, and Moscow could also offer what it calls protection of their sizable Russian minorities, as it did in Crimea. Russia already has hinted at this in discussions to extend Russian citizenship to ethnic Russians and ethnic speakers throughout the former Soviet Union. As we can see, the competition between the West and Russia intensifies as a result of the current Ukrainian crisis. But to understand this rivalry in Ukraine, one has to situate the Ukrainian crisis within the global rivalry between the West and Russia since the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War redrew the political lines of Europe. The Soviet Union collapsed, leaving 15 newly independent states in Eurasia. The Warsaw Pact ceased to exist, and so the former Soviet satellite states in Central Europe no longer were under Moscow's military and economic umbrella. With the West, happy to see this turn of event, the European Union and NATO then began the process of eastward enlargement. Over the next 15 years, many of the states from the former Soviet bloc were integrated into the Western Alliance structure. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO in 1999. The rest of Central Europe and the Baltic states joined European Union and NATO between 2004 and 2007. The push for Western integration did not stop there. Ukraine and Georgia both experienced color revolutions in the mid-2000s and urged in Western-friendly governments. These governments then formally sought to gain EU and NATO membership, with the West starting to support their long-term orientation toward these blocs in much the same way they did with Central Europe and the Baltics a decade earlier. This deeper push into Russian periphery did not succeed, but then Russia was no longer the weak and chaotic state of the 1990s and early 2000s. It had consolidated internally and recovered economically on the back of high energy prices. Russia was thus in a position to respond to these moves, which it did in the form of occasional natural gas cutoffs to Ukraine and the 2008 Russo-Georgian War. The war not only showed that Russia was able to defeat Georgia's militarily in a matter of days, Georgia seen as a Western ally in the Caucasus, but it also shows that the notion of the West would offer Georgia military support were illusionary. The war also served as a message from Moscow to the rest of the former Soviet periphery that it would not tolerate any serious effort toward further Western integration. Moscow used the next 5 years to push back against Western gains on the Russian periphery. During this period, it was the European Union and the United States that were distracted. The EU with its own political and economic crisis, and the US with its commitment in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. A relatively unburdened Russia took full advantage of this window of opportunity. Meanwhile, pro-Western governments in Ukraine and Georgia were voted out in favor of administrations more friendly towards Moscow. Russia strengthened its influence in other states courted by the West, such as Belarus and Armenia. It also boosted its own rival economic and security blocs, like the Customs Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organizations, to counter EU and NATO expansion. To conclude, the West's effort in Ukraine are therefore merely the latest chapter in this competition between Russia and the West that has taken various forms since the end of the Cold War. I conclude that.
Say your names, I guess, from you, Professor.
Pierre Jolicoeur, RMC.
ANA SILJAK, Queens.
Charles Pentland, Queens.
ZSUZSA Queens.
George PERLIN, Queens.
All right, so any questions? Question. Oh, I'm sorry, and can you also say your name before you?
Okay, my name is Ernest Yao. And I have two questions. First question is that, if we know that the referendum in the Crimea going to be started on March 16, and the question is that since if this referendum is passed and Crimea start to be independent, what this impact to other countries in in most South Eurasia, such as Belarus or Kazakh or Kyrgyz? What's their impact to them? Because those countries' presidents are maybe going to fear the same thing. I compare with the Yanukovych and Ukraine, that maybe the Russian one day they're going to invade them.
To whom is this? Sorry.
To any of you guys?
Perhaps, do you want to take the question?
Well, one thing is, I think the subject of the referendum is join Russia or not, isn't it? It's not independent. It's already declared independence. The Parliament of Crimea has already declared independence.
Yes,
I thought that,
what's the impact to other countries in Eurasia?
right. Well, you have to find parallel situations in other countries where there are minority regions or minority concentrations of Russian citizens where perhaps the same kind of strategy could be pursued by Russia as has been tried in Ukraine. There may be parallel situations. I mean, I suspect that Russia is more concerned with the countries we've been talking about, and less concerned with Central Asia at the moment, because by and large it has fairly satisfactory relations. It has fairly good control, I think, from its standpoint over the 5 stands, for example, if that's the ones you're really talking about. I don't know if anybody has
a second question.
Sure, you can have one follow-up.
The second question is that, because we all know that since in 2010 Yanukovych president has signed an agreement with Russia to say that to extend the time of rental time of the military base in Sevastopol. Is this correct? The city's name in Crimea, to extend it to 2042. And the question is that since the safety of this basis for Russians naval is kept and promised, why Russia want to intervene in Crimea instead of for the Donbas region in the east of Ukraine? Because there's more Russian speakers than Crimea in there.
Sorry?
Why Russia intervene in Crimea instead of the Donbas or Kharkiv area in east of Ukraine? Because there's more Russian speakers in there.
Well, not numerically. The percentage in Crimea is highest anywhere, the highest anywhere in Ukraine of Russians.
Yeah, and Professor CHERGO.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that actually supports what I was arguing, that the Putin government's intention is not so much to get Russians outside, or, all of the Russian nation within one self-governing state or something, but it's more strategic choices, and obviously Sevastopol is an important base. The naval base in Sevastopol is the reason why Crimea is much more important than other parts of Ukraine. But to go back to this, obviously, I said that the referendum was about secession. It reinforces secession, but it's about whether Crimea should become part of Russia. The interesting question about that, though, is that what surveys show is that the intention, a desire for joining Russia among Russian speakers in Ukraine is actually quite low. It's the highest in Crimea, and I think the latest poll showed 41% or something. And after this, Donetsk is next, and that's only about 33% or so. So it's not as though the overwhelming majority of Russian speakers in Ukraine would want to join Russia.
All right, thank you. Do we have another question? Oh, at the back.
Since this is going on YouTube, I'd like you guys to address what's being talked about on the internet a lot with this, specifically the far right-wing and left-wing blogs that seem to unite in their agreement that the CIA and the State Department are somehow behind the entire protest movement in general, and that they've affected it in any way or led it.
Anybody on the panel want to talk about the portrayal of the protests, I guess, in the internet community, if not the international media as a whole, or the portrayal, I guess, of the crises online?
All right.
Thank you, Professor.
you have to distinguish between the real positions and the rhetorical positions. And these arguments are being used rhetorically to substantiate the particular claims that each of the contesting parties want to make. I don't think there's anything more to it than that. The comments that Professor GEORGE made about the underlying impulse toward democracy that cuts across linguistic and regional divisions in Ukraine, that's substantiated by poll after poll after poll, and our data, which are quite substantial, would suggest that the notion that there is somehow or other some external force manipulating this is just not the case.
All right, thank you. Question up here.
Yeah. I guess this is a question for all the panelists. With Russia's sudden increased interest in Crimea, do you think that Poland and Lithuania might be concerned about an increased Russian interest in the Kaliningrad Oblast in the foreseeable future?
Any particular interest from a panelist in speaking first?
What would constitute a reason for that? I mean, Kaliningrad Oblast is now part of Russia. What more could it want? A corridor to a land corridor? Well, I mean, what if you were President Putin? How would you frame your demand for some change in Kaliningrad status?
No, it's Russia. They translated.
Yeah. Oh, question from over there.
Yes, for any panelist. I heard just the other day that Ukraine will plan no military intervention should the referendum go in favor of joining Russia. Does that actually open new doors for a Western recognition of the international border change? The lines of the borders will need to be redrawn. But is that contingent on, say, de facto review of recognition by other countries?
The fact that
if there's no military intervention.
If there are no military intervention from Kiev in Crimea to defend its territory, it doesn't mean that it is supporting the secession of Crimea. And it was clearly stated by the G7 and European Union yesterday, I think, they will not recognize the result of this referendum, not knowing what the result is. They would not recognize it because the conditions are not good to hold such a popular consultation. The presence of the military, of the Russian military on site, is disturbing. The parties did not have time to get prepared. It's in a rush, and it's illegitimate from the Ukrainian constitutional point of view. So for all of these reasons, it's not likely that the international community will recognize the result, for one. And for two, coming back to the very first question that was addressed from the crowd, from the room, such a referendum and a change of borders based on popular consultation would set a precedent in terms of international law. And it's not likely that the international community will support such a transformation over the borders because it will destabilize the whole international community. There are so many ethnic groups, potentially secessionists, that could want to replicate the Crimea model, if you wish. Nobody is even supporting of this. Not even Russia, I would say, because they're afraid of their Chechen problem or other parts of Russia. So it's not likely to be widely supported.
All right, question, sorry. Yeah.
So far we've heard a lot of analysis regarding like what's happening actually in the area where the conflict is occurring. But I just have a question as to what Canada's role might be or what our interests might be. Just following up on that last answer that like there would be a lot of international instability. Like how or what could Canada's response or sentiments be towards like the issue, I guess, the conflict?
Professor Pentland?
Well, I think we've seen it. I think we've seen it in the statements by the Prime Minister and by the Foreign Minister in particular. It's very much, as Professor Jolicoeur just said, there would be no recognition of of the results of that referendum, it would be dismissed on the grounds that he mentioned. I mean, we have Canada, naturally, like practically every other country in the world, will invoke the United Nations Charter provisions, the Helsinki Agreements, 1975, about the inviolability of borders, and not to mention the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which guaranteed where the Russians, the Americans, and the British guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So I mean, I think that Canada is broadly in line with that position, that these changes within Crimea by a quasi-government brought into power under duress would simply not be recognized.
All right, question right at the front here.
Hi, I just have a question about the relationship between Ukraine and the EU. Although Ukraine's been in the European Union, has already been highly recommended to going in. With the relationship between the Ukraine and the EU, and you were discussing, Dr. Pentland, about how they're being put into kind of a neighboring satellite community or union. Is it really beneficial to continue with such provisos and create such change in the Ukraine, or is it better to maintain stronger relations with Russia at this point, based on just the provisions of the charter that the Ukrainian government has to abide by?
Well, just on the last point, I don't think it's either or. I mean, this gets back to the distinction between the approach, kind of soft power institutional approach that the EU has taken towards Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space, and the way in which, as Pierre Jolicoeur described it, the Russians are playing an old-fashioned realist, zero-sum competition game. And those two things, from a Russian standpoint, it is an either-or game. From the Western standpoint, it can be, and it has been presented increasingly as a both-and. In other words, Ukraine can move more closely. It can accept the agreement, which, by the way, is back on the table, and it can also develop closer relationships with Russia. There are some technical things about customs unions and free trade areas that clash, and you can sort out some of that stuff, but it isn't insoluble. You can have, so I mean, I guess I reject the either-or premise of the question, if that's what it is. And we're a long way yet from anything approaching membership. What I will say is that out of all this has come, for the first time, a subtle hint from the EU that if and when things get back on track with the agreement with Ukraine, that they use this precious language, a membership perspective, may now be entertained, but that's way down the line.
I see Professor Chergo, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I agree that there is competition over Ukraine, but I don't think it's a competition between Russia and the EU over Ukraine. I think it's really a competition between the Putin-run government of Russia and the Ukrainian population about the question of whether Ukraine is going to become more of a democratic, or have more of a democratic political system and institutions, or it's going to be a Ukraine controlled by Moscow, which does not have a democratic government, obviously. So it's not only about maintaining the institutions clearly, but also to move into those institutions and actually practice democracy so that the kind of socialization can take place that, for reasons that have to do a great deal with Russian leverage over the Ukrainian presidents, has been slowed down, right? So the Ukrainian society has had 23 years to move in and start using those institutions, and in a way that resembles democratic practice. And in some ways, it has happened. There have been elections, and the elections have actually been followed by parliamentary politics that were not really questioned by opposition parties that lost out. Remember that in 2004, no matter how much the Moscow government tried to instate Yanukovych into power, they failed. And the fact that then Yanukovych came back in 2010 was not because Moscow wanted to bring him back, it was because Yanukovych won. Because the other government that had been put together by the victors of the 2004 Orange Revolution had failed to deliver the public goods that the public was looking for. So Yanukovych came back not because Putin wanted to, well, of course Putin was happy, but he actually won the elections in 2010, and then the opposition accepted the results. So that's why I'm saying that Moscow has actually failed to a great degree in this competition over Ukraine as a democracy or Ukraine as a Moscow-controlled entity so far.
Can I just add to that? I realize that I'm taking up time.
This is good.
I want to come back to this question of the Russian minority population, because I think, yes, I agree with you. Right now, they are still there with Ukrainians, right? I think your surveys do point to the fact that there's an opportunity here to integrate them into the Ukrainian future and to make them see that it's not an either-or choice. I think the dangers of the future come in the treatment of that minority and their perceptions of the situation. And that's where I think this question of the language issue and a host of other cultural nationalist issues, if I were the Ukrainian government, which I'm not, but if I were, I would tread carefully there, because here is their opportunity to keep these people in. If there are increasingly hostile moves on the part of the new government, then things can get out of control, out of everybody's hands, and I think maybe even out of Putin's hands, right? In other words, if the Russian minority starts to get really restive, this may be a situation which even Putin can't manage.
All right, there were a couple of hands that shot up, and I'm actually going to stand up so I can see everybody a bit better. Over there, yes.
I want to comment on a statement you made about the European Union's poor management of dealing with Ukraine, like with regards to treating them as a satellite or neighborhood policy, whatever. I'm interested in how what's going on in the Ukraine could potentially kind of leak into the southern states of Europe that are also experiencing a lot of problems with corruption and public perceptions of corruption. In Spain, public perception of corruption is around 96% of their political elites. So do you think what's happening in Ukraine could have any effect on these Southern European leftist movements for more transparency?
All right, so bringing it, I guess, back into a broader perspective, does anybody have any particular thoughts? If not, I will start.
Let me just say that I'm not sure I can answer the question, the really heart of the question, but I did not ever use the term satellite. I mean, that came from a previous question. That's a loaded term in this context. You know, the states and the members of the European Neighborhood Policy they're parked in a certain area, but there are a lot of benefits to them in that area. It's a zone of broader Europe, and now at least Ukraine has some prospect of moving from there in the distant future into a staged process of accession to the EU. So, you know, the term satellite is not one that is used in these circles. But I don't know. I think others probably could handle the
I was hoping maybe Professor PERLIN, you could speak to this.
Well, I don't want to speak to that. May I speak to something that was raised just before that question was asked?
Sure.
Okay. Well, it's a question of whether the new government in Ukraine is going to address the problem of ineffective progress toward democratization. No fixed constitution, right? There is a constitution, but it can be changed by a vote in the Rada. So essentially, if you can get a majority in the Rada, a significant majority in the Rada, you can change the constitution. They've done nothing to deal with the corruption of the judiciary. They've done nothing to do about, they've done nothing with the criminal code, which dates back to the middle of the 20th century under the Soviet system. All of these things have to be addressed. So the point I want to make is this. The word conditionality, the term conditionality has been used here. Ukraine wants $30 billion from the United States and the European Union, and I guess a few dollars from Canada, the IMF. There has to be a clear understanding that if it is going to be given this kind of support, it has to make these kinds of reforms. So to achieve what Professor CERGO has talked about in respect to realizing the goal of creating a genuine democracy there, we have to use our leverage.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions. So first I'll take, right there in Toronto. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, I missed the first 2 panelists speak, so I might be raising a point that's already been covered. Should the West, and in particular the EU, pursue stronger action against Russia, more definitive action? I mean, some people have been raising points talking about placing economic sanctions on Russia as a means of sort of forcing it to back down based on the current situation of their economy. What's your stance on all of this? And this is sort of open to anybody.
The question is, should the Western countries add pressures on Russia? Certainly. I mean, the way that Russia is dealing with the crisis is unusual in the international area. And but so far, we have to realize that it already started to hit Russia's economy. And the central bank currently is doing a lot to try to maintain the value of the ruble. It costs, I've seen a report, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, it already costed $15 billion to Russian central bank in trying to support the ruble because of the threat of a war or an increase of the economic sanctions. So there is an effect, and we've seen a lot in the past days in reports and news that Western Europe is dependent on Russian gas and oil, and then they cannot impose too strict sanctions against Russia because it can hit them a lot. But we have to consider that the dependency is mutual in both sense. And Russia is dependent on European market as well to obtain these foreign currency. And it's not to the benefits of Russia to continue this game too long. So I don't know for how long Russia can sustain such a game of power play.
All right, and our final question. I guess you, sir, who was standing up earlier.
There's no anyone behind me, right? Okay. I have a question for, I guess, all the panelists. My name's Eddie. What's the perspective of the Russian people, and does it matter at all what they think?
The Russian people in Russia?
In Russia.
In Russia. So far, I've seen a survey yesterday. They are supporting their president. They see President Putin as being very, having a strong sense. It has always been painful, pain for Putin. The rates are, so far, I've seen 69% approval rate. So the people are seeing the way he sees global politics on the right way. And the Russians are proud of their president. So the popularity of Putin is increasing. So seems to be, if it was only for domestic politics, that would be painful for him.
Professor CERGO?
Yes, an important aspect of that, or reason for that, is that Putin's government controls the Russian media, and so they control the message, and the message that's sent to the Russian public and also to the population of Crimea, because other channels have actually been turned off in Crimea, is that this government in Kiev is indeed a government of neo-Nazis and fascists and nothing else. And so that's one reason why the Russian public sees this as a patriotic act of defending Russians abroad. But this really is linked to the comment that Professor Siljak has made, and I cannot agree more with her, that if the Ukrainian government wants to make this work, then they absolutely have to deal with the language policy question differently. Because I think that one of the triggers of this crisis definitely was the change to the language law that they made. It was one of the first acts of this new Ukrainian government. And that was obvious. It was a no-brainer that was going to create a lot of anxiety among Russian speakers. It seems, though, from current surveys, it seems that the majority of the population, including I think in Western Ukraine, prefers a solution, a language law that would provide official status to Russian in the regions in which Russians make up a significant ratio of the population. So there is very broad-based support for that. And it's, again, goes back to political actors for making the right choices and turning the cultural diversity either into a resource that's a positive resource, that's an enriching resource, or into a political resource for themselves, for populist ways of manipulating society to keep themselves in power.
All right, thank you everybody for your questions tonight. Just a couple of closings, I guess a closing remark for myself is thank you all of you guys for coming out. Thank you for sure to all of the panelists who were able to share their thoughts and their research with us. Today we've touched on themes of power, identity, increased political legitimacy, and corruption. For more on Ukraine, you can also check out Write a Reply on Kia's Facebook page, which had an interview with PhD candidate Philip Roseberry last week, March 5th, about the situation then in Ukraine. And if you're interested in getting to know your professors a bit more and about their research, I encourage all political studies students to come to Beer with Profs next Wednesday, March 19th at the Grad Club at 4:30 p.m. And you can purchase tickets for that in Mac Corey starting next week. We now have a few closing statements from Kia President Digvijay Mehra.
Yeah. Thanks again for coming. A quick few other thank yous. Thank you so much to Dr. Amio, who really was the impetus behind organizing this. So he's here at the Political Studies Department. As well, thanks again to all the panelists. Beyond what Isabel just said, I was informed that I need to quickly inform people here. If you are interested in coming to the Kia Gala, we have tickets here at this event. You can come and talk to us afterwards. Also, as I mentioned before when we started, if you're interested in getting involved with the club, a bunch of our executives will be here later on to talk to you if you have any questions about that. Beyond that, do check out the Write a Reply, our radio show, which is on podcast version online about the same issue. As well, we have our magazines. Most recent issue was published this week as well. You can view that online as well. Beyond that, again, very grateful to all the panelists for this very timely discussion, and thanks, of course, as well to Isabel for moderating. So thank you everyone for coming out.